In today's episode, we're going to be talking about how to improve your repeat sprint ability for hockey in order to improve your performance on the pitch. So if we start off by explaining what repeat sprint ability is, in the literature it is generally regarded as a sequence of high intensity sprints, more than 3 in terms of frequency, and interspersed with less than 21 seconds per effort between those efforts. So for example, 3 high intensity sprint efforts within a minute period would generally be regarded as repeat sprint ability. So rather than one-off efforts, we're talking about successive bouts of high intensity work interspersed with short recovery periods. And this really is the high kind of characteristic, if you like, of the game of hockey. It isn't lots of long, slow distance running. It is high intensity with short periods of recovery in between. And so we could generally regard this as a hybrid sport with both really high aerobic demands from the fact that you have to be able to do this successively without fatigue throughout the course of the game, and also anaerobic by design, the fact that you have to be doing these high intensity work bouts in successive efforts with small periods of recovery in between. So you need to have both a well-developed aerobic system and the ability to recover between really, really high intensity efforts as well. So that's why it's so important for hockey. And how we go about improving it? Well, first of all, it begins with actually assessing how good we are at repeat sprint ability, because it's all well and good improving it, but we can improve it much more quickly if we know what the limitation is. And generally, due to work from lots of great researchers out there, we can start to kind of define what it is and also what the limitations are for an athlete, whether that's something like speed, whether it's their change of direction ability, whether it might be their recovery between efforts, or it might be their aerobic fitness as a limitation. Something I've spoken about at length before is the use of something called the hierarchy of needs approach. And what we mean by that is certain physical qualities are more important earlier on than other physical qualities. Or in other words, aerobic fitness is more important for a hockey player to be able to last a tournament rather than max effort sprinting, because you might be able to do a sequence of high intensity sprints, but if you can't do that in the last game of a tournament, it kind of doesn't really matter as much as being able to be available on the pitch for the whole duration. And then once that's in place, then we start to worry more about things like repeat sprint ability. So having this baseline foundation of high workload capacity, aerobic capacity, is really important in order to enable players to basically last a full tournament. If it's just individual games, that's still important, but it means you can last the full duration of a game. Again, you might be really, really quick, but if your ability to recover between efforts is quite poor because you're aerobically limited, then by the end of the game, it doesn't really matter how quick you are, you're definitely not going to be sprinting very quick because you're going to be very, very fatigued. So that's the kind of underlying philosophy there of why aerobic fitness is so important. Now, when we come to assess it, a very useful test can be either two options here, a 6x30 or 8x20 meter shuttle. So the 6x30 is a linear test, 30 meter sprint max effort with 30 seconds recovery, or the 8x20 rolling 30-second test, which is my preference, is 20 meters out and back with the remainder of that 30 seconds to recover. Performed 8 times, and what we're looking at then is the total time of those 8 successive bouts we're interested in. We're also interested in the fatigue index, which is how quickly those times start to drop off, and also then the initial time, which is the quickest time we can achieve, and then the slowest time and the kind of difference between those two. And what's going to happen here is you're going to get different profiles off the back of that. So you're going to get someone who's going to be really, really fast, but perhaps they're aerobically quite limited. Or in this sense, they're quick in the initial, but their times drop off rapidly. You might get someone who's really quick and can sustain it. So they're an amazing athlete, both anaerobically and aerobically, so more of a hybrid profile. You get athletes who are highly aerobically developed, but their speed's quite poor. So in other words, they can sustain their efforts pretty well, but the speed itself isn't particularly great. Or you just get unconditioned athletes who are neither quick or fit. So you kind of get in sort of 4 different profiles off the back of that assessment. Now, what you can do prior to that is assess aerobic fitness first to know if that is the limitation on their performance. And we could do things like a 16 pitch lengths run. If they're meeting a certain threshold criteria, you then know that player has met the aerobic qualities we're looking for, and therefore it's not a limitation to repeat sprintability. If we only do the repeat sprintability without the 16 pitch lengths, we don't know if the limitations are aerobic fitness if we haven't tested that in isolation. So it's important to understand whether they are aerobically limited to begin with. If not, then we come into the repeat sprintability test, and we can then put the athletes into different quadrants. So it's unlikely, therefore, that they're aerobically limited if we've already tested that. We know they're hitting the benchmark we're looking for. So then we start to look at, okay, well, is it actually their sprint speed which is limiting them? Or is it their change direction ability? Or is it their ability to recover between those efforts, which is more of an anaerobic capacity or lactate buffering consideration? So if an athlete therefore comes in, we know they're aerobically well developed, but their drop off is quite significant, we can then break it down from a qualitative perspective saying, okay, well, actually, is their technique not very good in those change of directions over time? Is that causing a lot of load? Are they not particularly eccentrically strong and therefore can't change direction very quickly as they get fatigued? Or is it more to do with their physiology or metabolic conditioning in the sense they can't actually recover quickly between efforts, and therefore that is what's limiting them? So we can begin to break that down. So if we also know from the initial time their top speed of a 20-meter shuttle is good, then we know that max speed's not a limiting factor. We've already done the 16 pitch lengths. We know aerobic fitness isn't a limiting factor. And if we looked at it from a qualitative perspective and their technique around the change of direction, looking at those kinematics, and actually their technique is pretty good, then it must be that their ability to recover between the efforts from a physiological perspective is the limiting factor. And therefore, it must be their ability to tolerate the anaerobic byproducts of this high intensity work. And so that means that athlete is limited primarily at the moment by their ability to buffer lactate and also to develop high levels of anaerobic capacity. So we can work through that kind of thought process to figure out what actually is the limitation for that athlete at any given time. So taking it back a step, if an athlete comes in and their aerobic fitness isn't good, then that's all we need to know. That's the thing that needs to be worked on, because it will continue to be a limitation in their performance until it's addressed. Just because you get quicker and your changing direction technique's good, by the end of a full game or the end of a tournament, it really isn't going to matter, because the aerobic fitness is still going to limit them. So it's important that gets addressed to begin with. Then once that's addressed, we look at their initial sprint time, and if someone's initial sprint time is poor, again, that is the limiting factor. That's the thing we need to then work on next. If it's not aerobic fitness and it's not their maximal effort, but they're still dropping off, then we know that it's probably going to be something related to their technique or something related to their anaerobic capacity. And that's the kind of thought process that we can work through when trying to improve repeat sprintability for hockey players. What we can then do, of course, is test pre and post, and a sort of typical time frame on these types of adaptations and qualities is around a sort of 3-month mark. So trying to test it more frequently at this sort of high intensity may or may not be appropriate, but that's generally the kind of timeline you might be looking at to give enough time to really work on these qualities and then reassess the impact of the program. The other beneficial thing with that is you can look at changing the profile. So you might try to maintain their top end speed, but improve their ability to sustain that. That's obviously quite an important one. And then thirdly, it might be that actually we're just trying to go all out on speed, and it's going to be a lot of high intensity speed work in that kind of 3-month period. And that's going to hopefully be the thing that changes their profile and improves their performance in repeat sprintability testing. A couple of interesting nuances to repeat sprintability testing is that when you're looking at different profiles, you might see an athlete whose fatigue index, in other words, their drop-off, is actually less than another athlete. But what matters most predominantly is those initial sprint times and their intensity of those, the speed at which an athlete can execute their efforts, rather than just the drop-off alone. Because you might get athlete A who can sustain performance in the repeat sprintability testing, but their actual speed's quite poor. So we then know that, well, they're still not going to be performing particularly high intensity work on the pitch. They're not going to have a huge amount of impact. Or athlete B might be struggling with maintaining their efforts, but even their third or fourth effort, they're still sprinting more quickly than athlete A because their top end speed is that much faster. So although they're struggling to sustain it, their actual individual efforts are still more impactful on the pitch than someone who's slower. And that's the kind of nuance of this testing. It's important to make sure that you're not just looking at things in isolation, but in the context of actually compared with different players, what does that profile mean in the context of performance overall? So the most important thing to take away from this is that you've got to assess, you've got to understand what the limitations are, and we need to work through a hierarchical model in order to understand what the rate limiter is in an athlete's performance with repeat sprintability. So is it aerobic? Is it top speed? If it's not those two things, it must be something else, and then we can go into more detail there. Other tests you might want to use to kind of coincide with this are things like a 505 test, just to isolate the change of direction without the fatigue as a factor. Things like linear sprinting to understand their actual top speed or velocity and whether that's a limitation. And also just looking at a out and out linear acceleration and deceleration to see again if those component parts are the things that are limiting them. And that also comes down to the strategy that athletes use and whether their acceleration is good but their deceleration is not. Or maybe their ability to change direction and re-accelerate quickly is the limitation. But that's another video for another day in terms of sprint techniques. So that's been a good sort of high-level overview of what repeat sprintability is, how we can go about assessing it, what the different factors are to consider. And in future videos, I'll be talking about how to actually program for these things with example conditioning sessions.